So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third day of this home retreat. And my name's Shanta Chitta, and I'm introducing people today. And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Akasha Raja, who is going to talk to us on living ethically with the climate and ecological emergency. Akasha Raja was ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order in 2001 and lives with his family in Shrewsbury, UK. He's active at his local centre, as well as being a very occasional local radio pundit. He was instrumental in setting up Extinction Rebellion in Shrewsbury in 2018 and wants his and all other children to inherit a viable world. So this morning, he's going to talk about living ethically with the climate and ecological emergency. He says, the environmental crisis we're experiencing can trigger very strong emotional responses, including fear, anger, blame, and othering. Yet the Dharma is utterly uncompromising in its insistence on our taking responsibility for our own mental states and the inevitable suffering that will follow if we don't. So how can we respond skillfully to the challenge? Also, how can we make the shift from an appropriative to an appreciative attitude to the world, seeing beauty and potential in those whom we feel inclined to blame for our plight? This session will include a presentation, a chance for discussion in breakout rooms, and a metta bhavana with a difference. So welcome to Akasha Raja. I look forward to his presentation.
Many thanks, Shanta Chitta. There's a big picture of me in the middle of the screen. That's very disconcerting. I guess I'll get used to it. Yeah, welcome all. It's nice to see you in your tiny little thumbnails at the top of my screen. I might scroll through from time to time. I wonder how we all are this morning. I think it's always good to start off, rather than launching into content, just to start with a little bit of grounding. So I'm going to propose that we do that. And to be perfectly frank, it's something I kind of quite need to do, as I've not been on this retreat. Full disclosure, I've actually been away on a bit of a holiday. And a lot of me wishes I was still away on a bit of a holiday. So I feel slightly bogus sitting in front of you in the context of a retreat that I've not been on, I'm afraid to say. But I will do my best. I will do my best to adapt and get into the zone. But let's just settle for a couple of minutes. So you might want just to close your eyes and settle into a comfortable posture. And just bring your attention inwards. Allowing awareness to flow down away from the thinking mind to the points of contact with the earth, with Mother Earth, holding us up. And you can let go fully to gravity. Just allowing your attention to rest at those points of contact. Allowing awareness gently to spread throughout the body. So just getting a sense of your physical being, in your environment, wherever you are. Bringing a kindly and inquiring awareness to the heart space, the heart center. Checking in with your emotional being. Open and receptive to how you're feeling. Just allowing yourself to settle into awareness, into the present moment. And when you're ready, just turning your attention back outwards to the screen. Okay, so I've done a bit of disclosure that I've not been on this event. Further bit of disclosure is that I've personally found the last few weeks really quite challenging in ways that I'm sure many of you can appreciate, with the kind of global situation as it is, how things can feel sometimes particularly fragile. How the world as we know it can sometimes feel as though it's sort of spinning out of control. And I've noticed within myself all sorts of responses, you know, wanting to get off, stop the world and get off, as they say, wanting to distract myself, wanting to lose myself in the world of the senses, and so forth. And all of which are entirely understandable responses. And I'm bringing them to this talk because, of course, it's a personal talk, as all talks that any good talk is a personal talk. You bring yourself to it, your own concerns, your own experience. And as such, the talk is a kind of extended note to self, if you like, or as Shantideva says, it's a way of perfuming my own mind to remind me to do things which in a way I know very, very well and are, as it were, really quite obvious. Yeah, ways to bring more skillful states of mind to bear on my experience. So it's a sort of personal account, and as such, I'm not going to make any claims to it being kind of exhaustive. I'm not going to give an exhaustive breakdown of the precepts. It's more of a kind of journey through my own learnings, I suppose, or places where perhaps I haven't yet fully learned, and I hope I will be able to fully learn. So, as I say, a note to self. So it's a talk that basically I gave at the North London Buddhist Centre as part of a series on the perfections, so the 6 perfections of the Bodhisattva. And being a good Triratna order member, of course, the first thing I did was to check out my etymology to make sure that I knew what I was talking about. So I looked up the word paramita, so Shila Paramita being the perfection of ethics. And it's quite interesting, actually, because it can mean highest, chief, primary, most excellent. But it can also be divided into para, mita, and para means beyond, as in the sense of the further shore, the further bank. And mita means that which has arrived, or ita, that which goes. So paramita means something like that which has gone beyond. In other words, it's a transcendent quality. So ethics, when practiced in its fullness, like all of the other perfections, is essentially the preserve of the Buddhas. It's a Buddha quality, it's an awakened quality. Yeah. It's not something that we can necessarily hope to practice in where we are now as unawakened beings. And that being the case, Srila Paramita, so the perfection of ethics, like all of the other perfections, is, if you're a Buddha at least, is informed by perfect wisdom and perfect compassion. So it's not about being good. It's not about rushing about doing good, or it's not about observing or adhering to particular rules and regulations. Yeah, it's not about externals. It's not about following commandments. Again, this is all very familiar ground, I'm sure, but I find that I have to keep reminding myself of this. So it's never a bad thing to hear obvious and basic Buddhist truths time and time again. So I'm particularly interested in illustrating this with using two of the visions that the Buddha had when he was becoming the Buddha. Because I think they illustrate two really important points about ethics that kind of complement one another. So there were two visions that are, well, there are visions which are mentioned in the account of the Buddha's enlightenment, and the first of which is as he was opening up to the vastness, the incomprehensibility of enlightenment, the vision opened up for him of the lives of all sentient beings being born and reborn and living lives, and the quality of those lives and the experience of those lives being determined by the mental states that people were in and sentient beings were inhabiting. So he saw beings being born, living, having a particular experience and dying. And the quality of that experience was completely determined by the quality of the mental states of the individuals, the beings concerned. So what he was seeing unfold in his Dharma vision was the law of karma, that quite simply that actions have consequences. He saw the predominance of mind. And there's a very famous quote from the Dhammapada, which I'm sure you've all heard, but it bears repeating, which I'm just going to read out to you, which is the very first thing in one of the most significant and important Buddhist texts. And it's this: experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So those are really evocative images. On the one hand, you get the sense of the sort of grind and the difficulty and the weight and the sort of general kind of heaviness of what happens when one has an impure mind. The sort of the weight of the cart, the straining of the ox, the sort of general difficulty that one has. Whereas if you live in an impure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So there's a lightness to that. There's a sort of a freeness and a freshness to that, which is very, very different in quality. So actions have consequences. So as I'm sure you know, Buddhist ethics is essentially to do with our state of mind. Yeah, you could actually just simply say that a loving mind is an ethical mind, and an ethical mind is a loving mind. So what the Buddha saw was that there's absolutely no getting around the predominance of mind. Yeah, the quality of our experience, the quality of our ethical lives is entirely down to the quality of our mind. Yeah. So this brings both responsibilities, but also a sense of potential, of excitement, of liberation. So the quality of our experience and the quality of our future experience is in our own hands. Nobody else can determine our future happiness or misery. It's entirely up to us. It's entirely in our own hands. So that was one of the points. Maybe like a sort of more cognitive understanding of the nature of reality. But then he had another kind of more resplendent vision, if you like. So you may remember that at one point he's become fully awakened and he's sitting there and he hesitates because the sort of what he has experienced is so profound and so subtle and so difficult to kind of communicate that he hesitates. For a moment he feels as though he won't possibly be able to communicate it, and maybe it would be better to simply remain silent and not to teach. And then, of course, Brahma Sahampati, the ruler of the gods, appears to him and entreats him to teach, saying, you know, there are beings out there with but little dust on their eyes, so do teach the Dharma. They will be able to hear the Dharma. And the Buddha has this grand, this amazing vision of all sentient beings like lotuses in a vast lake. So lotuses of all different colors, you know, all resplendent and beautiful in their own way, and all at different stages of development, different stages of emergence. So some quite close to the sort of mire and mud at the bottom of the lake. And apparently, lake lotuses do grow in muck and mire and dirty water. I was listening to a talk by Pattabhadra just last night talking about this. So some of the lotuses were open kind of beneath the water, sort of quite close to the bottom of the lake. Others were a little bit higher up in the water, and perhaps even just starting to emerge, starting to break the surface and come into sort of full expression in above the surface of the water, in the full light of the sun, as it were. So what the Buddha was seeing there was the kind of individual beauty and potential for freedom, for liberation of all sentient beings. And having seen that, he felt compelled to act. There was no question that he wasn't going to go and teach. His compassion, his Buddha compassion, was fully triggered, fully awakened. And he accordingly spent the rest of his life teaching the Dharma, trying to bring people to that experience of fulfillment of their potential. I think it's interesting to reflect on what the nature of that vision was. I can't imagine that it was as if the Buddha was sitting there casting about for some sort of metaphor to describe people. It's not as if he was saying to himself, what are beings like? Oh, they're a bit like lotuses, aren't they? You know, I don't think it was like that at all. I suspect in some sort of way, and maybe I'm being a bit fanciful here, but that was what the Buddha actually really saw. He didn't just see people with all of their kind of flaws and all of their sort of imperfections and all of the stuff that makes us people, that causes us to suffer. He saw through that to our essential potential. Yeah, that was a direct experience. And he saw that because his perception, his awareness had been completely cleansed of any vestige of greed, hatred, and delusion. So he was seeing things in a very, very different way, in a completely different way that we can sort of perhaps barely imagine. But imagination is the key to this. So we are not Buddhists. Well, I'm not a Buddha. I can't speak for anyone in the room. I cannot, that kind of state of purity of perception and awareness is not my natural state of being. So what I have to do to sort of close the gap between me and the Buddha, perhaps what we have to do, is to sort of use the imagination. And I'm going to quote a very, very famous quote by the poet Percy Shelley, which I think is a really, really good way of describing the principle of Buddhist ethics. And Shelley has to say the following. So the great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our nature, and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. A man, to be greatly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasure of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination. So in other words, there's a sort of twin basis of ethics here, if you like. There's that understanding that mind is primary, that it's our responsibility, our responses, our ethical responses to what happens to us are entirely our responsibility. And on the more kind of effective emotional side, there is that sense of cultivating a heart connection with all beings, a sense of interconnectedness with all beings based on their and our shared potential for awakening. So this means, for us, this means two things. This means that we need to strive to take responsibility for our ethical responses, and we need to strive to remain connected with other beings, with their qualities and their flaws, with their concerns and their potential, that we need to keep our hearts open. And that's essentially what we do in the Metabhavana meditation. And so the question is, how do we approach our ethical lives with these points in mind? So I'm just going to take a kind of selective journey through the precepts and draw some lessons from my own experience. And maybe these will be instructive to you, maybe they will illuminate the point a little bit. I'm mostly going to draw on the positive precepts in a way, because I think those are a particular expression of Bhante Sangharakshita's genius. If you take the negative precepts are kind of like the sort of working bare minimum. So abstaining from things, abstaining from harm. And of course, that's important. That's the vital basis. But Bhante, in his presentation of the positive precepts, goes that radical step further towards the perfection of ethics, towards what we can actually do to perfect our ethical lives. So if we take the first precept, well, it's I undertake to abstain from taking life, with deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body. Okay, so there's that whole sense of purification. How can we purify ourselves? How can we move towards becoming those lotuses, flowering, standing clear of the water? And I think it's probably worth reflecting that some deeds of loving kindness, well, they may look like deeds of loving kindness, but they actually aren't. Because what's missing from the deed can be that sort of, on the one hand, that awareness of taking responsibility for our own ethical lives, and on the other, that sense of connectedness with other beings. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of examples, humdrum examples from my own life. But I think humdrum and what apparently trivial examples are important, because that's the level at which we tend to have to work. So I bought an electric car. Okay, I drive an electric car. That could be, you know, to all intents and purposes, it looks like a deed of loving kindness, doesn't it? You know, I'm driving an emissions-free vehicle, and by sort of reducing my contribution towards the emissions crisis, towards global heating and so forth. So far, so good. But accompanying that, at least in my case, is a very, very sort of difficult attitude towards people who drive SUVs. Okay, so there are plenty of SUVs in Shrewsbury, and we have quite narrow streets that aren't really very kind of suitable for big cars. But people like them, and they're very popular, and you see a lot of them around. Okay, so what happens is I'm out driving my electric vehicle, or perhaps out on my bike, I'll see an SUV, and before I know it, a particular train of thought will kick in. a particular train of thought will kick in. Almost, well, it's as if I don't do the train of thought. It just arises habitually. And it's something like, look at you driving that big car, you know, taking up all the space in the road and you know, guzzling petrol. You don't care, do you? You don't care. I bet you don't think about the climate and ecological emergency or about the welfare, the well-being of future generations. You're just caught up in your own selfish interests and your own desire for status and showing how prosperous and how well off you are, etc., etc., etc. Not very edifying. So I won't elaborate any further. You know, the sort of thing. Maybe you have your own particular versions of this. Okay. So if I do that and I allow that to be my prevailing mental state, then driving an electric car can be nothing other than virtue signaling. Look at me, you know, and my moral one-upmanship, right? Okay. So it looks like one thing, but it isn't. In reality, it's something different. Or if I might do an organized litter pick. And I could choose to spend the entire litter pick fulminating at the kind of thoughtlessness of the people who drop the litter, which I am clearing up with my good deed. But my good deed then basically becomes an act of passion, passive aggressiveness, yeah, rather than a deed of loving kindness. Because what's missing in this case is, well, to start with, two things are going on here. I am kind of not taking responsibility for my own negative mental states in a way. I'm then engaged in a process of blame the SUV drivers for the plight of the world, or I'll blame the litter bugs for polluting my lovely environment and putting me into all sorts of negative mental states. And the other thing is a failure of the imagination. It's a failure of the imagination to sort of see the potential of the people driving the SUVs, to see what we have in common. What the sort of stuff that we do in the Metabhavana, you know, these people are human beings, they have particular needs, they want to be happy, and they're seeking to realize their happiness in a particular way. Maybe part of their process of realizing their happiness is to drive a nice, big, spacious, safe car, but also kind of gives them a sort of sense of security in themselves, you know, that they've arrived somewhere and can project that into the world through having a nice car. Yeah. So maybe they feel safe. Maybe, you know, they feel protected in their car. Maybe they have to ferry lots of people around in their car. I mean, what do I know? I know nothing about the background of these people. I leap unimaginatively to assumptions in a knee-jerk kind of way, based on all sorts of media tropes from the left-wing media, mostly, and without any kind of attempt to engage imaginatively with the lives of those people. So what I'm doing in that situation is a classic example of othering. Yeah. There's me on the side of the angels with my electric car, and there's all of that, there's that lump of people over there who are other, who don't care, who don't care if the world goes to pot, yeah, whose own selfish desires for status and so forth are more important. So that lack of imagination causes a sort of fundamental divide between me and other people, a fundamental polarization. And with that polarization, of course, empathy is excluded. Yeah. So what I have to remember to do is to re-engage the imagination. I have to imagine myself into those people's situation. And that can be hard work, because sometimes being right and being righteous feels good. Yeah. Sometimes it feels good to sort of get worked up about people. But as the Dharma tells us, and as the law of karma tells us, you know, you don't get away with it. Karma does not let you get away with it. It doesn't give you time off for being right, as it were. So SUV drivers, other people that we seek to blame, other groups that we may seek to blame in the light of the climate and ecological emergency, the bankers, the fossil fuel industry, yeah. See how we group people into opposing camps and put them over there beyond the pale. See how we then fail to kind of realize and empathize with their human experience. or to take a topical example that's not directly related to the climate and ecological emergency, the Russians, which is something those of us who were brought up in the Cold War will recognize. At least in my experience growing up, was the Russians represented a sort of monolithic force of evil, of menace, rather than just human beings on the other side of a political divide. And what I find, to stay with that theme for a moment, is that if I see the Russians in this particular instance as a monolithic block, then that greatly increases my fear and my sense of estrangement. Whereas if I engage my imagination and resolve them into people, then that opens the door to empathy. Yeah, that opens the door to empathy. So it's vitally important that we continue to engage the imagination, that we do what Shelley does, yeah? That we imagine intensely, even if it can be hard. Because everybody wants to be well and happy, nobody wants to suffer, and everybody wants to be fulfilled, even though some people have a damn old way of expressing it, as far as we can see. Yes, so we need to have a certain flexibility of mind, a willingness to be wrong. And I'm going to quote the middle verse of a lovely poem by E. E. Cummings, which is my poem of the moment, which I bring in at every possible instance. And some of you may recognize it, but the middle verse of the poem runs like this, and it says, "May my mind stroll about hungry and fearless and thirsty and supple, and even if it's Sunday, may I be wrong, for whenever men are right, they are not young." So I think the situation we're in requires us to have suppleness of mind. It requires us to have that flexibility to imagine ourselves into the lives and the concerns of other people, other beings with whom we may disagree very strongly. So that was what I wanted to say on the subject of loving kindness, of deeds of loving kindness. So what you do is less important in a way than the mental state in which you do it. What about generosity? So again, sticking with the positive precept, Shantachitta mentioned that I set up the Shrewsbury branch of Extinction Rebellion in 2018, which is true, in as much as I convened a meeting. I wouldn't lay claim to having done much more than that. And a whole bunch of people turned up towards the end of 2018, and suddenly there were about 50 people in this cafe that I found myself talking to about Extinction Rebellion. I'd been extremely inspired by the video footage of the bridge occupations earlier that year, because they seemed to me to be sort of permeated with a spirit of loving kindness, really. And I felt very inspired and moved by that. So being something of a compulsive initiator, I still thought to myself, well, we should do that. We should have that in Shrewsbury. So I did it. And then I found myself trying to run XR in Shrewsbury with a small group of people. And for various complicated reasons, by about February of the following year, I'd approached a state of total burnout. Yeah, I was running on fumes, partly because of my own complex psychology, and partly just because of the confronting myself on the daily basis with the sort of seriousness of the issues and grinding myself into the dirt. Yeah. And I've never, generally speaking, I have quite a sunny disposition, but that was the only time in my life when I've come close to suicidal thoughts. Yeah. In about February of that year. So what I was doing, it looked like giving, but it was just, I was running on empty. Yeah, I was giving out of a sense of fear and sort of out of kind of a sense of emptiness rather than a sense of fullness, rather than an experience of plenitude. So a sense of duty, I suppose, having started this thing, I needed to see it through. But if generosity is going to be truly open-handed, then it has to be unimpaired. It has to be unstinting. It has to come out of a sense of fullness. It has to come out of, we have to be able to give with all of ourselves. So again, I'm not going to sort of even to start to suggest ways in which one might give in relation to the climate and ecological emergency. You know, whatever you choose to do. My only advice would be from my own experience is give from a state, give from a experience of inspiration, give from a sense of connection with living beings, give by doing what you love doing. So more recently, my approach to protest has been to sit in meditation. So at various exile protests with various people, including at least one in this room, sitting down on a city street in silent meditation. And I love doing that. And the experience of meditating in that way I find it invariably easy to engage with, just naturally, just to sort of slip into a kind of state of openness, of receptivity, a complete kind of engagement and complete fearlessness. And more recently, a number of us from the Shrewsbury Sangha have sat on roundabouts, traffic roundabouts in the town with placards around our necks, you know, love and grief for the earth. And one would think you might feel quite vulnerable sitting there with your eyes closed, but I've never felt that. Because I've been giving out of a sense of fullness, out of a sense of wanting to share something I love. And that seems to have driven out that kind of sense of fear and vulnerability. And it's always been fine. Never had any trouble with that. So giving out of a sense of fullness, whatever it is that you choose to do, however you choose to engage. So if you feel that you're slipping into duty, and that sense of dutifulness is underpinned by anxiety, by unease, by fear, by polarization, then just kind of, I think it's perfectly okay just to stop, just to walk away, put it down, engage with something else. So that's the second. So what about the third precept? Again, the positive precept, sort of stillness, simplicity, and contentment. I'm going to read the first verse of E. E. Cummings's poem, the one I just quoted. And it runs like this. May my heart always be open to little birds who are the secrets of living. Whatever they sing is better than to know, and if men should not hear them, men are old. So may my heart always be open to little birds. So in the morning, I'll come down to my kuti at the bottom of my garden, which is where I am now. And the garden's starting to look really nice and to come to life. And I can see blossom in the tree, and I can see things budding and unfurling and starting to express themselves. And I can hear birdsong. And there's something about birdsong, if you let it, that just cuts through other stuff, that brings you into the moment. There's sort of the sort of piercing and bell-like clarity of birdsong that brings you back into the present, or at least it does to me. And just stop and listen to the birdsong, and all of a sudden I will find myself in a still center. And I think that still center is really, really important. I find it's really important for me because it's a natural antidote to propensia, to proliferation. Yeah. So finding a way to connect with that still center as part of my life as an activist, as part of my life as a human being, actually, for that matter. Just being still and listening to the birds. Not as a sort of therapy, not as a way of making myself happy, but purely just for the sheer beauty of the thing. And again, taking the going back to the sort of busy and noisy protests that I've been involved with, creating a still center for other people in the middle of them. If going on marches and protests is your bag, which it may be for some of you, then showing people your stillness, allowing that stillness to be something that radiates, that is communicated, a still pole, as it were, a quiet pole, as opposed to the pole of activity and sort of noise and craziness that goes on at protests. And people really appreciate that. Activists really appreciate it, in my experience. They appreciate knowing that Buddhists, they like having Buddhists around. never quite worked out why, but maybe it's something to do with that. Maybe somebody sitting in meditation at a protest might even be somebody's fourth sight, if you're familiar with the idea of the Buddha's four sights. You know, the wandering mendicant who set the Buddha off on his quest for the truth. So creating the still center and inhabiting that still center as a way of just, yeah, counteracting the craziness and the sort of the world and its tendency to draw us out of ourselves. And then there's the whole area of speech. So, yeah, and speech, of course, including all the ways in which we communicate, including, of course, the social media. With the immediacy of the social media, how tempting it is just to fire off a post or a tweet or something before you've really kind of considered it or stopped to sort of feel into how you're feeling at the time when you send it. Yeah. Sort of not taking responsibility for your own ethical and emotional state at the time you send the post and getting involved in conflicts, wars of words online. That's one obvious thing that I think it's important to try and avoid. So stopping and thinking before you launch into social media dialogue communications. So when you get ordained into the true act, the Buddhist order, you know, there are 4 speech precepts. So speech should be truthful, but it should also be kindly, helpful, and harmonious. I was at an XR protest with Peksha Priya at London Bridge last autumn, I think it must have been. And there was this wonderful, sorry, I'll stop the beeping, it's my phone binging, I do apologise. Yeah, so as part of the protest, they had found this wonderful old bus, which was parked in the middle of this junction leading up to London Bridge. And there were people sitting in this bus in finery, sort of as if they'd gone to some kind of garden party at Buckingham Palace or something. I can't remember the symbolism of it or what exactly it was for. But anyway, it was the centerpiece of this this particular protest. And at some point, I'm afraid to say, the police just waded in, and it was the first time in my life I'd ever directly witnessed excessive police use of force. Yes, it was definitely an excessive and unwarranted use of force. So they basically they waded in with truncheons and sort of tried to storm the bus, and the people on the bus were trying to resist. And there was a guy on the roof kind of trying to kick back, you know, against this sort of policeman who was trying to climb on the roof to arrest him. And it all kind of petered out, and they spent about the next 3 hours, as far as I can remember, standing on the bus with the protesters, and it all looked a bit stupid and unnecessary. But what happened was that the crowd erupted into a chant of "We're non-violent, what about you?" And the irony of that chant was, as far as I could see, it was actually quite aggressive. It was quite an aggressive assertion of non-violence. And I think in some ways, there can be, people don't make the connection between acts of physical and bodily non-violence and acts of verbal and indeed mental non-violence. Yeah, and I think in those kind of situations, it's very easy to get caught up in that. Yeah. So, yes. So there was a sort of irony there, which I think probably escaped a lot of people. You know, this sort of aggressiveness of that non-violent shout. So I often struggle with chanting at protests for that reason, just because no matter how kind of right the sentiment is and how kind of positive it is, it's easy to get sucked into a kind of, to be sort of sucked into a kind of group awareness, a group consciousness, which can turn on a dime to something, you know, more aggressive and less wholesome. Yeah. So, yes. So I think it's just really important to bear that in mind, that it's, you know, non-violence also extends to the realm of speech. And when I started the XR group in Shrewsbury, in my kind of Buddhist naivety, I suggested to people that I wanted the group to be, or anything we did, to be non-violent in terms of body, speech, and mind, which to me seemed completely obvious, but again, I'm not really sure that people got it. Yes. So just areas to be aware of in terms of speech, really. So trying to keep the speech kindly, helpful, and harmonious. And sometimes that may involve not saying anything. It may involve just maintaining the noble Aryan silence, yeah, and not joining in, and refraining from returning that, from replying to that incendiary comment on social media or whatever, because we'll all be the better for it. You know, it does wonders for your mental states not engaging in kind of verbal and written battles, I find. And of course, that the devices, the sort of divisiveness of that speech and of the chanting, again, is a sort of expression and a reinforcement of othering. Yeah. So of course, what the people on the protest were doing at that point was creating this sort of polarization between themselves and the police, who I guess were doing their job, were acting on instructions. Not that I would defend the use of brutality, but again, the principle holds good of just using the imagination, under conditions of difficulty, especially, to realize that it's other human beings that you're dealing with, rather than a kind of implacable and hostile force. So, I've often spoken to police officers on protests, and when you engage with them, you will find that up to the point where their professional duty stops them from taking sides, that they will be very amenable to what's going on, to the protest, and open and sensitive to its message. Dare I say, some of them would join in if they felt they weren't crossing a professional boundary. But anyway, that's an aside. That we go like that. Thanks, Angela. Yeah. And then finally, the sort of, the fifth precept, so abstaining from intoxicants, from taking intoxicants, and mindfulness clear and radiant. This really needs addressing from both sides, because it's so important and so easy to get wrong. So intoxication, is, aside from all of the well-known intoxicants, this can also apply to, I think, to sort of absorbing too much bad news. Yeah, sort of absorbing too much climate doomism. Yeah, absorbing too much Ukraine war, getting too overwhelmed in keeping up with the news when there's so much bad stuff happening. That itself can be a form of intoxication. And I noticed that in myself over the last 5 or 6 weeks. It's almost as if I follow the news as closely as possible in some way, that allows me to exercise some kind of control over events, which of course is not the case. I'm not advocating burying one's head in the sand. I don't think that's an adequate response for me personally. Some people may well disagree. But we have to kind of be sensible and balanced in terms of preserving our own kind of basic well-being, but not getting sucked into this kind of frightening spiral of kind of prepension and anxiety about the fate of the world, by over-absorbing, by overindulging in media, in what's happening in the world. Sometimes you just got to stop. Sometimes you just got to sort of take time out from that, and realize the effects that such things will have on your mind, and how that can induce fear, and certainly in me, and how fear is an inevitable way of shutting myself down, and severing the connection between myself and other beings. So again, coming back to that point of keeping the channels of communication open, keeping our hearts open, remaining aware of other beings, other people as people, rather than just as a sort of a lump over there which is full of menace and hostility. So I think you have to, as an antidote to all of this, it's really important to engage with beauty. Yeah, in whatever way works for you. Because beauty, engaging with beauty opens the heart in a way that fear and overwhelm, anxiety close it. So to give you an example, I sing in a local choir in a choral society. And it is without doubt the most powerful indirect method of working on the mind, to use that terminology, that I have in my life. So there's meditation and there's singing. So if meditation is the direct way of working on the mind, I find singing with other people, creating beauty, creating harmony, an incredibly powerful tool for hope, for the restoration of some kind of belief in human possibility. So say, for instance, I've been rehearsing for the Mozart Requiem, which, if you know, is one of the most amazing pieces of music. So I've come out of rehearsals at times just feeling and thinking to myself that a species that is capable of producing such sublimity, such beauty, is capable of anything. Is capable of rescuing the world, is capable of turning this thing around. Whether or not that's fanciful, whether that's actually borne out in practice, nonetheless, engaging with beauty, in this case, the beauty which is the creation of the human mind, is a really good way, a really sort of powerful antidote to the kind of closing down, the fear, the othering response, which is such a kind of tempting and easy spiral to get into. So finding your own access to beauty. And I think the choice of words for mindfulness in Bhante's positive precept is interesting. So mindfulness, clear and radiant. So it never really occurred to me before I started thinking about this the other day, about mindfulness being radiant. And I guess that can mean two things. It can mean that the person who is mindful has a particular radiance. They get noticed, they have a kind of aura. People notice, people respond to somebody who is truly mindful. But I think there's another way, kind of more subjectively, in which, mindfulness can radiate. And I think about mindfulness in this context as a sort of feelingful intelligence which imbues the things in the world that it comes into contact with. Yeah. So if you're really in touch with yourself, if you're really in touch with positive emotion, then your world, the world in which that you experience, the world of the senses, can be imbued with this sort of quality of beauty and harmony that is often closed down to us when we're not in positive mental states. So when you on retreat, or when you get up from having done the Metta Bhavana, and all of a sudden colours are brighter and fuller, the world seems more full of meaning and beauty and harmony, and even small kind of mundane experiences can be infused with a sort of beauty and clarity of their own. And it's an absurdly small example of this, that when I was on a retreat very early in my Triratna career, just a weekend retreat, the simple sound of somebody putting a cup down on a surface filled me with this sort of tremendous sense of happiness, because it was beautiful, because my own awareness had to some extent been cleansed and purified. And so there was another occasion, I'd just come off a solitary retreat, which I'd done a lot of Metta Bhavana, and I went up to a shop. This was in Llanberis in North Wales. And there were some very ordinary people in that shop. Well, I say ordinary, what do I know? That sounds rather patronizing, but they didn't look anything special, but my awareness had to some extent been cleansed by doing lots of Metta Bhavana practice. And it was as if these people were infused with a kind of inner light. Yeah, they were kind of radiant in themselves, because my awareness, my perception, to some extent, been cleansed by the meditation practice I've been doing. Yeah, so I think we could approach mindfulness in that way. Yeah, you know, radiating mindfulness as a way of sort of engaging more fully with the beauties of the world around us, with the beauties of people on their own terms, not as something that, not as a sort of therapy, not so that we can get something from them, but just seeing beauty and seeing harmony and seeing potential in things in the world around us. Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing to try and connect with. And it's where ethics sort of crosses over into aesthetics. I always tend to think there's a strong link between ethics and aesthetic, that an ethical life, a life ethically lived, is a life aesthetically. If the ethical life is the beautiful life, then of course an ethical life is going to be aesthetic life. And so, you know, on the kind of macro level, it seems to me that the sort of pillaging of the Earth's resources, even if it wasn't leading to large-scale environmental degradation and destruction, is somehow unaesthetic. Yeah, there's something unaesthetic, rather ugly about gouging, you know, great lumps out of the earth, about pillaging its resources to serve our particular human needs. And so that suggests to me that one of the things that we need to be aspiring to is living as lightly as possible in everything that we do. Yeah, living lightly, living ethically, and living aesthetically. So trying to move in an aesthetic world through the purification of our own mental states and through the application of the imagination, through which we appreciate the potential, the beauty, the special individual quality of other beings and other things that are not ourselves. So I'm just going to finish off with E. Cummings. And then I'm going to be, well, we're going to have the possibility of going to breakout rooms. And I don't really have any sort of clever questions to ask you, but it's made just an opportunity to reflect on the talk, to reflect on your own ethical working ground, to see if it struck any chords with you. It's just an opportunity to sort of share, to swap notes for, let's say, actually we should probably say 10 minutes because I've really gone quite over time. Yeah. Anyway, may my heart always be open to little birds. May my heart always be open to little birds who are the secrets of living. Whatever they sing is better than to know. And if men should not hear them, men are old. May my mind stroll about hungry and fearless and thirsty and supple. And even if it's Sunday, may I be wrong. For whenever men are right, they are not young. And may myself do nothing usefully, and love yourself so more than truly. There's never been quite such a fool who could fail pulling all the sky over him with one smile. Thank you.